Warrior, rebel, commander, survivor. Fidel Castro led a revolution that reshaped Cuba and made it the first communist country in the Western Hemisphere. His rule spanned the administrations of 10 U.S. presidents, and his life became a symbol of defiance to the United States. Castro encouraged socialist movements across Latin America and made an important impact in the region in other ways. Joining me now to discuss Fidel Castro's influence on Latin America is Peter Kornbluh, director of the National Security Archives Chile Documentation Project and of the Cuba Documentation Project. Welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
You have met Fidel Castro, conversed with him, spent time with him. What was he really like as a person?
Well, it's hard to know him deeply personally, of course. I met him in a professional capacity. We had a number of private lunches and a couple of state dinners around two conferences that I helped organize with his office. One was on the 40th anniversary of the famous, and some would say infamous, Bay of Pigs invasion led by the Central Intelligence Agency. And the other was on the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which, of course, was the moment in our recent history when the world came closest to nuclear Armageddon. And we were able to bring extraordinary historical actors from both of those episodes from the Cold War to Cuba to sit down with Fidel Castro. He graciously received even retired CIA officials who had once tried to assassinate him. And one of my most extraordinary moments was having the deputy director of the CIA's Bay of Pigs operation sitting in a conference room at the Palace of Conferences in Havana, across the conference room table from Fidel Castro, and saying, you know, Fidel, when you were in the mountains leading the insurrection, I was on a CIA Caribbean task force monitoring your movements, and I want to let you know that we were all Fidelistas at that moment. We thought you were a romantic figure. The CIA initially thought that Fidel would be the spiritual leader of democratic forces in Latin America, which shows you the quality of their intelligence at the time. But he graciously received former members of the Kennedy family, CIA officials, Robert McNamara, who had been Secretary of Defense during the Kennedy administration, and so many others. He was a historical figure. He carried a lot of history right up in his extraordinary mind. And now that history is somewhat gone to the grave with him until the Cuban government decides to declassify many of his personal papers so that those of us, the students of his history, can continue to learn more about what he did and his role and what he thought.
Talk about his role in Latin America, because he inspired this sort of generation of leaders across the region, and they certainly had a different interpretation of what he stood for than in other places in the world.
You know, Fidel Castro played the role of David versus Goliath when it came to the imperial United States of America. It's hard to really describe how the United States had controlled Cuba in the first half of the 20th century. I mean, Cuba basically became a playground for the rich and famous of the United States, and a mafia stronghold and a corporate stronghold. All the major U.S. agricultural and communications corporations controlled all of Cuba's economy. The U.S. Congress came within a couple of votes of annexing Cuba as another state of the United States of America in the 1800s. That's how presumptuous the United States of America was when it came to Cuba. And of course, we occupied Cuba at the turn of the 20th century after the Spanish-American Civil War, rewrote the Cuban Constitution, et cetera. So Fidel really stood up to the United States, and that was part of the nationalism that was generated by the U.S. kind of hegemonic pressures on Cuba, really inspired him. And when he was able to not only overthrow Batista, but then tell the United States to take a hike, you know, the revolution meant that Cuba was going to have an independent government and an independent foreign policy. That certainly started off this Cold War confrontation. But in the eyes of so many others in Latin America, a region that kind of in a larger sense has also struggled under the hegemon of U.S. influence and economic control for so many decades, particularly in the 1800s and the 20th century, somewhat less in the 21st century. in the eyes of so many Latin Americans, Fidel was a revolutionary model. He was the classic revolutionary. He defeated a CIA-led invasion. He kicked out the major corporations, the agricultural corporations, United Fruit, the oil corporations. He said Cuba's going to be a small country, but a proud and independent country. And that inspired quite a few people in Latin America and created quite a few problems for a lot of governments. And Fidel was known for his commitment to solidarity, his commitment to revolution, and that made him a hero among many in Latin America.
Do you think he was misunderstood then by a lot of other people around the world? Because some, people take issue with other things he's done.
Well, revolution isn't a positive thing for a lot of people who stand to lose when a revolution takes place. The United States didn't want to see leftist revolutions in Latin America. The phrase "not another Cuba" became very prevalent in internal memoranda and the national security bureaucracy of the United States of America. No more Cubas, no more Cubas. I remember a time when it was no more Chinas, but after the Cuban Revolution, it became no more Cubas in the Western Hemisphere. So I don't know that Fidel was misunderstood. I mean, if you lost out, if you were imprisoned by Fidel, if you tried to organize against Fidel and were caught, obviously he could be extremely repressive. And the things that are said about his human rights abuses and his abuse of power are largely true. He took the position that Cuba was threatened by the United States of America, and that you had to have a very tight national security defense, and that included keeping those people who might be agents of the United States, and he called every dissident an agent, whether they were or not, from gaining a stronghold in the society. And so he was very repressive, and Cuba was a very tightly controlled state under his rule, and to a degree still is today.
Cuba is really known for its healthcare and its medical diplomacy, sending its doctors and nurses around the region to help those in need who are experiencing the aftermath of natural disasters. So talk about some of the positive things that Cuba is known for and that Fidel started.
Fidel attached tremendous importance on universal education and universal health care. And he really elevated Cuba, particularly in the late 60s and 70s, to be very high in the world indices on infant mortality rates, on health for toddlers, and on access to education. He attached a great emphasis on the fact that anybody who had the know-how up here could go to medical school. And he opened the doors to Cuban medical schools, not only to tens of thousands of Cubans who would otherwise never have had an opportunity to go to this kind of school, but also to Latin Americans and other members of the Third World. He gave scholarships to Guyanese students where there was not a single medical training facility in the entire country to come to Cuba in the 1970s and study medicine and then go back to their country as doctors. He created a medical brigade, an international medical brigade, kind of Cuba's version of Doctors Without Borders, and sent them around the world. He sent them to Haiti. He sent them to Africa. Raul has just sent them to fight the Ebola virus, for example, but Fidel was sending them to countries even before Raul took over. And these programs also gained Cuba tremendous status. I was in Cuba with a friend from Peru just this last May, and we went to eat at this organic farm, and there was a guy cooking there for us. And he said, "Oh, I was in Peru. I was there with a medical brigade. I was the cook for a medical brigade that went to do free eye surgery for Peruvian peasants in the hinterlands that didn't have access to surgery, had cataracts, but if with proper care could actually have their sight restored." And this is the type of program that gained Cuba, a small Caribbean country, that one never would have expected to gain this type of international status, the prestige that it had under Castro's leadership.
Peter, what does the future of Cuba look like without Fidel Castro? And the future of the region? Is this the end of an era?
Well, it certainly is an end of an era. In some ways, it's the end of the 20th century. In some ways, it's the end of the Cold War of sorts, particularly when it relates to Latin America. It's not the end of the controversy inside Cuba about Fidel's legacy there on the economy, on the society. It's not the end of the Cuban Communist Party, which continues to be deeply entrenched as the institutional leadership of that country. It's not the end, I don't think, now with Donald Trump coming in, of the U.S.-Cuban conflict. We may well see a return of the efforts of the United States of America to push Cuba around. And that's a frightening thought, frankly, and certainly a regressive process, unfortunately. But Fidel kind of will leave an international legacy for Cuba that Cuba will continue to try and meet, of playing an important role in the world, a role that is far larger than its actual geographic size. And I think that's the legacy that a lot of people will remember him for.
Peter Kornbluh, thank you so much for joining us on America's Now.
Thank you for having me on to talk about this historical issue.
America's Now